This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. Development aid takes on big challenges, trying not only to reduce poverty, but create stable governments, end violence and conflict, fight corruption, and foster democracy. In these complicated and interconnected efforts, what works and what doesn't? To try to answer that question, the Brookings Institution, a Washington-based think tank, is bringing together data and research from around the world. Joining us to talk about the new initiative is Daniel Kaufman, Senior Fellow for Global Economy and Development at the Brookings Institution. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Eric.
So it would seem that right now is a time when development aid would be under a fair amount of pressure with Western governments facing a lot of economic problems of their own and perhaps not being in a position to be as generous as they might have been in the past.
That's correct, and that has been the case for a few years. But it is important to note that the commitment of different countries varies, and even in the midst of crisis, some countries in Europe, particularly the Nordics and others, have kept up very much their commitments, while in other cases that has not been the case. The bottom line is, however, that aid to developing countries is still very low, and most people don't know that, and that's part of our new website showing all the data, is that it's a very small fraction of the income GDP of the rich country, but it's a very small fraction on average of the GDP of the recipient, lower income countries.
All the more reason that aid should be effective and efficient. What are the biggest challenges that tend to keep aid from being effective and efficient?
Well, there are a number of challenges, and one of the indicators that we have showcased in this new website and new tool, which is very interactive and user-friendly, that we just launched, is in fact to be able to visualize and show how effective is this aid. There's a new index, in fact, on the quality of aid.
And what's that index measure? How do you know whether aid has been effective or not?
Well, there are many different metrics that go into those index and different components in terms of the efficiency and efficacy, in terms of the use of that aid, in terms of how much capacity building and learning is done with that aid, in terms of the extent of transparency in that aid, and also another dimension where we have also a separate index which we just created, and it's happened in that website. It's about the vulnerability of the aid to poor governance and to high levels of corruption in the recipient country, which has not received sufficient focus in the past because it is a sensitive issue. But the bottom line is that we're talking about over 1/3 of all aid goes to highly corrupt settings, and that's a sensitive issue, and I think it should be showcased.
And so does the data show more than allow you to see in ways that perhaps you hadn't been able to see before the interaction between things like poverty and corruption and poor governance and other ills?
Absolutely. I think in that sense, this website that we developed with our colleagues, notably Homi Karas, Veronica Penchakova, and others at Brookings, makes interaction possible among different variables in development that usually in websites are in silos, and one goes for one Excel or another file, but one is not allowed to interact. And very graphically, one can interact, for instance, the extent to which corruption in a country affects GDP. And one can do that for the whole world and can see it also moving over time with these motion charts and so on. It's totally up to the user to select which variables one wants to interact among the development variables, the aid, including aid effectiveness and total effective aid going to a country, and governance and corruption variables.
And is there anything that helps you figure out how you reduce corruption? I mean, the problem with aid, you're bringing money or other goods or resources, and that, by its very nature, I would think, creates the opportunities for corruption that, that you're trying to get rid of in the first place?
Well, some of that aid, which, when it's not effective, it brings up those opportunities. It should be pointed out that also quite a bit of the aid that goes to settings which are very challenged in terms of governance, countries that are challenged, but there is new leadership and they are reforming, and there is an understanding that then institutions have to change, and there is significant reforms and anti-corruption programs. That's okay, and aid there can help. And we find that some donors that give aid are pretty good in choosing countries that may have relatively high corruption today, but in a few years we see it, we track it, and we see that the effectiveness of aid is such that corruption reduces over time. The challenge is that's not the rule. Many other donors turn a blind eye, or they are not effective regarding helping countries improve governance and controlling corruption.
How much of this is in effect this difference in how donors approach the problem is a result of a sort of new types of donors getting involved in development aid, new people who haven't been part of the traditional development community?
Well, yes and no. It is known already that new donors, including some of the new emerging countries like China, for instance, have a different approach to aid than the traditional aid givers. The same applies to some private donors. However, this database is for traditional donors. And the interesting thing that we find out that even for traditional official donors, over time, there has not been an improvement in the selectivity of aid vis-a-vis helping improve governance and controlling corruption. Some donors are doing a bit better, but others donors are doing worse.
How much pushback is there at this point on efforts to reduce corruption, efforts to get civil society going? We see in some countries where there have been a pushback against non-governmental organizations trying to operate in this space, notably in Egypt, and new laws proposed in Russia to limit NGOs. Is this going to be something that spreads?
Well, hopefully not. We find that the glass is half full and half empty. The good news are balanced by the bad news. Basically, the sobering news is that the world at large has not made progress in controlling corruption over the past 10, 12 years. And in recent times, that still applies. For every country that makes an improvement, and there are a number in Latin America, my own country, in Chile, it's an example. It's among the top 20, 25 in the world in controlling corruption, basically where the United States is. Not the best, not the Nordics or New Zealand, which are the model, but it's up there. Greece and Italy are 90 to 95 in terms of ranks in controlling corruption, very poor. So let's keep this in perspective. It's not just a problem of developing countries. There are a number of industrialized countries that have high level of corruption, and that's related to the crisis in those countries as well. And for every country that has made improvement, like the Chiles, the Botswanas, the Ghanas, a number in Asia, there is another country that has deteriorated, and then there are many in the middle. So on average, there has not been an improvement. And then you have the additional problem over the past few years of these basically electoral autocracies, we call it. So increasingly they're becoming more sophisticated. Some countries have elections, yet they are very managed and they're not true democracies. And there is a problem in Russia, for instance. So there is obviously an attack from a non-democratic perspective on anti-corruption crusaders and anti-corruption movements.
And now we see such different countries that are moving in one direction or another direction. You've got this website, this interactive set of this database that brings together all sorts of information. Does it help you see in any way what causes one or another country to move in a direction of greater poverty or less poverty, or on the other hand, move in a direction of greater transparency or less transparency?
Well, it's important to manage expectations, Eric. The website itself will not answer all those questions. Hopefully, by providing so much data, and it's country by country for over 200 countries, for over 40 donors also in terms of aid, it empowers basically researchers, scholars, students to go to the website and begin playing with all these variables, and also downloading the data and doing further research. Further, at Brookings, we do have papers and an analysis with this data, which attempts to answer some of those questions. So we have done, for instance, some analysis of what works and what doesn't in terms of anti-corruption. Just as an example, anti-corruption commissions usually fail, or just adopting another decree, it usually fails. One needs a much more systemic approach, voice, democratic accountability, free press is much more important than just by decree having another agency to combat corruption.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Daniel Kaufman of the Brookings Institution, thanks so much for joining us.